as I'm here today, I want to also acknowledge the working group leads and project leads who are joining as part of this presentation and to help with the Q&A. So we have Krista Faulkner, UBC's transportation engineer, who's technical support and doing a lot of the heavy lifts for the UBCO transportation plan. Colin Richardson, our energy systems manager, and Glenn McIntyre, our energy specialist, who are really leading the charge with respect to building and energy supply side. Gary Hartung, our Associate Director of Food Services, who's leading a lot of the implementation of the low carbon food recommendations, and Dr. Mary Stockdale, who's a lecturer in human geography at UBCO, who is leading up faculty representation on the air travel working group, as well as co-chairing the food group. So thank you everybody for being here and joining today. So to kick us off, I wanted to talk briefly about the impetus for the Climate Action Plan at UBC. And we all know too well that the global climate crisis is accelerating, and many of the decisions and actions we take today will extend beyond our own borders and lifetimes. UBC, as we know, has committed to address the climate crisis with the urgency that it requires through the Climate Action Plan 2030 process initiated in support of UBC's Climate Emergency Declaration. And so, as Madeline mentioned, at UBC Okanagan, this will be our first Climate Action Plan. And among its objectives, the plan is intended to address some of the key input that we heard through the climate emergency engagement process. We also want to acknowledge that there are a number of key objectives for the Climate Action Plan at UBCO, but really that this builds on a lot of the foundational work and achievements of the campus over the past 10 years. And so in many ways, the CAP is about continuing this work. So for example, we've achieved a 33% reduction in operational emissions from our 2013 baseline. And many of you may know we've recently completed an award-winning new student residence called Skina. It's a 220 unit building that was completed in 2020 and is on track to be the first Passive House certified university dorm in Canada. So now with the CAP, we're looking at accelerating these actions, expanding on these, as well as moving into the new area of extended impacts, which is really exciting because this looks at areas like our emissions from commuting, food, waste, and business air travel. And these are all the areas where everyone can collectively make a difference. It's also worth noting that throughout the development of the CAP process, the teams really looked to integrate a climate justice lens across many of the emerging actions to help address specific questions framed through the Climate Emergency Task Force and the engagement process. And addressing climate justice is particularly relevant as it relates to some of these actions around food systems, commuting, and air travel, so that we work to strive to find ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an equitable manner and recognizing that the choices we make have a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable. So as we continue down this process, our understanding of climate justice will continue to evolve, and we'll engage leaders from Climate Hub and other experts to help ensure that we fully implement this lens in our planning. This is just to say that there are also a number of other factors influencing the CAP, the Climate Action Plan, and this has a little bit to do with our operational emissions and some of the liabilities that we have around raising carbon prices. So for example, the federal government announced an increase of its carbon price on fuels to $170 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030, which BC's carbon tax will have to match to stay in compliance. Public sector offset requirements add an additional $25 a ton to this cost. So UBC's and UBCO's rising carbon liability must be considered when we assess the level of ambition that the university will aim for with the CAP 2030 and the potential for further investment in clean solutions to reduce our carbon liability. So in terms of the process, the CAP process itself launched last spring with the development of working groups across multiple themes. And through this distributed working group model, individuals from many departments were engaged to co-develop actions, which has begun to build more capacity for implementation. UBC Okanagan's initial focus for the Climate Action Plan has been to support emission reduction plans and actions that were currently underway with the highest potential for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so these focused initially on areas such as energy demand, supply, commuting, and food through projects including the Low Carbon Energy Strategy and the UBCO Transportation Plan, which you'll hear about in a bit. Specific efforts were also made to identify working group recommendations in areas such as business air travel and waste reduction that could apply to both the Vancouver and Okanagan contexts. And so these are areas of activity with UBCO staff or faculty involved to develop Okanagan specific climate action plan recommendations. In February, we presented emerging directions for the Climate Action Plan to the Board of Governors, and we will move forward to draft the Climate Action Plan based on a number of inputs, including feedback from the board, and very importantly, your feedback as part of this consultation process, and plan to complete the plan for presentation to board in November. So just taking a step back now to think a little bit about the different sources of emissions that I spoke about earlier, this figure really helps us to visualize the sources of emissions that make up UBC Okanagan's greenhouse gas footprint. So campus greenhouse gas emissions are generated from two areas. On the left, you'll see emissions generated from campus operations, which includes buildings, campus energy facilities, and fleet vehicles, also known as Scope 1 and 2 emissions in GHG accounting terms. UBC Okanagan has direct control over these emissions, and we do pay a carbon offset taxes on these emissions through provincially mandated legislative requirements for all public sector organizations. We know that reducing these emissions will require infrastructure change and capital investments. And to date, we have successfully, as I articulated earlier, reduced these emissions by largely enhancing the energy performance of existing buildings, as well as expanding the campus's existing district energy system to new buildings. And then on the right-hand side is what we're calling extended impact emissions, also known as Scope 3. These are emissions from other activities that UBC only has an indirect influence over, such as business air travel and commuting. So in contrast to the operational emissions, extended emissions are influenced most strongly by students, faculty, and staff, and the individual choices and actions that we make. UBC has an indirect influence here through policies and programs that can support social change. However, the opportunity is really up to our community and each one of us to make significant impacts through the choices and changes we make. This slide just presents a bit of a snapshot of our existing situation in terms of the greenhouse gas footprint for UBCO. You'll see the bar graphs on the right. Those show the current distribution and proportion of emissions from both campus operations in the gray and purple colors, and then extended emissions in the orange and green and more brightly colored hues. You can see quite quickly campus operations account for only 14% of our total emissions, which is currently about 2,400 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the majority of those are attributable to heating and operating our buildings with natural gas. And the extended impact emissions on the right, the ones that we're able to measure right now, generated from commuting, air travel, building life cycle, and food, these represent 86% of our overall campus emissions, approximately 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and really representing the most significant reduction opportunity where the UBCO community members can affect change through their own actions. So this is really about, a whole campus initiative when we think about the Climate Action Plan and its successful implementation. It really does require all of us to take ownership and responsibility in our respective positions and think about how we can advance the strategic mandate of the university while also remaining true to the bold and ambitious commitments outlined in UBC's Climate Emergency Declaration. So I'm now going to touch briefly on the emerging Climate Action Plan goals and actions for UBC Okanagan, focusing first on operational emissions, and these are currently in development. And just a reminder that a detailed list of all the Climate Action Plan 2030 emerging actions are available in the board report that was presented in February of 2021. We have links on our websites and our various materials to this more detailed report. So as we've seen, the greatest potential to impact UBCO's operational emissions is by addressing building and energy supply strategies to reduce natural gas consumption. And work is currently underway by operational teams to support decisions and actions specific to setting campus operational greenhouse gas targets for the CAP, as well as some work on building retrofits and campus infrastructure expansion. Analysis shows us that we can achieve between a 65% and 80% reduction in operational greenhouse gas emissions from 2013 baseline if we use a combined approach to address both building and energy supply to campus buildings. So on the energy demand or the buildings side, the team has developed a strategic energy management plan, which has identified projects to reduce building energy consumption, utility costs, and carbon emissions in existing buildings. An analysis demonstrates that continued implementation of this plan over the next 10 years alone will achieve a 50% emission reduction by 2030 from our 2013 baseline. Then on the energy supply side, we are developing a low carbon energy strategy. This plan focuses on decarbonizing our district energy system supply and addressing buildings and assets not currently connected to the system. It will provide a foundation for the integration of waste heat, renewable energy, and other low carbon energy sources in future. The low carbon energy strategy is advancing technology like thermal storage to displace natural gas use to serve future campus buildings, such as potentially the new interdisciplinary collaboration and innovation or ICI building, which is currently in design. Given the Board of Governors' endorsement of the President's Climate Emergency Declaration, as well as sustainability priorities, staff will continue to find ways to integrate the goal to reduce the carbon footprint of this future building as we embark on the planning stage now, as well as its operations, and to identify cost-effective measures that will reduce both embodied and operational carbon throughout this design development process. And this wedge diagram just gives you a visual of what I've articulated just now in terms of our potential to reach between a 65 to 80% reduction in operational greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So you'll note on the wedge diagram, the very top orange line that kind of slopes up. This is a business as usual line. So were the university to not take any action, our emissions would just continue to climb over time. And then the green wedge shows the impact of the implementation of the Strategic Energy Management Plan, which gets us to our 50% target. And then beneath kind of two tiers of district energy decarbonization potential. And so in the least, we see based on our current analysis, we'll be able to get down to 65% reduction. And then were we to go much more aggressively, potentially down to the full 80% reduction. Investments will need to be made in higher performance buildings and retrofits, definitely decarbonizing investment as well to hit these targets. So shifting now to extended emissions, the target for all of the extended impact areas is to reduce emissions by 45% in alignment with the Paris Agreement target. to align with the mandate of UBC's climate emergency. And as noted before, the success of this depends on alignment of many stakeholders and engagement as well in terms of actions that can be taken to reduce our collective impact. Most of these reductions can be driven also by policies and programs to influence behavioral change through engagement, capacity building, and awareness. And certainly these behavioral change campaigns have the potential to save costs for the university as well in terms of efficiencies garnered. Empowering the UBC community to affect change is really the key here. So there are currently 4 strategic action areas with targets that I'll get into in a little bit more detail next. So looking at extended emissions by area, staff, faculty, and student commuting is one of UBC Okanagan's largest source of extended impact emissions. Approximately 64% of extended emissions, or 9,000 metric tons, are attributable to commuting. And as was described earlier, this is significantly greater than the direct emissions produced by the campus. UBC Okanagan's transportation plan is currently in development and will support the Climate Action Plan's overall strategy to address commuting emissions by providing transportation targets and a suite of strategies required to meet the transportation targets. The plan will be reported separately to board along with the Climate Action Plan in the fall. And so it's worth noting that one of the largest and most immediate opportunities to reduce commuting emissions builds on the lessons learned during COVID-19. And that is to look at ways to support remote working, flex days, and e-learning going forward. We know that human resources, along with many teams, are involved in scoping out this work further, and we anticipate to learn more in the coming months. The transportation team is also considering what is needed to deliver on potential infrastructure, as well as programs that really look at targeting behavior changes around things like cycling, for example, or adoption of the electric vehicles. This wedge diagram focuses on the potential to reduce commuting emissions by implementing some of the draft bundles of actions identified by this planning process currently underway. So not to get into too much detail here, but the preliminary analysis looks very good in that it shows us that if the proposed draft actions are fully implemented, we are on track toward a 50 to 60% reduction in commuting emissions by 2030. And certainly this, we do have the potential to exceed the 1.5 degree Paris reduction target. Okay, moving over to the area of food systems. Key members of UBC Okanagan's existing food strategy group have assembled a UBCO CAP Food Working Group, and it's comprised of nearly 20 faculty, students, and key operations staff charged together in a role to explore opportunities for UBCO to reduce its impact at the procurement, transportation, food preparation, and waste disposal stages. This work is aligned with a relatively new in-house operation model of food service that was extended to UBC Okanagan in 2019, which aims to provide local and environmentally friendly food options. So it's worth shouting out as well, this group recently completed a campus-wide virtual dialogue series to help inform emerging climate-friendly food recommendation in the areas of food supply, waste, and behavior change that will be refined in April. And as well, we are looking to identify actions to address these emissions throughout the food system that apply to both Vancouver and Okanagan campuses, such as the implementation of climate-friendly food labeling. Business air travel is another high-impact area and one of UBC Okanagan's largest sources of indirect emissions. Based on available data, it accounts for at least 25% or 3,500 metric tons. Much of this travel is for business between the campuses and to meet academic and research requirements. By leveraging the recent learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic, including the availability of better communications technology solutions, it is anticipated that air travel can be reduced while maintaining or improving UBC's educational and research objectives. This certainly does acknowledge the dependence upon air travel for faculty and students to carry out certain types of research and scholarly projects, as well as dependencies between the campuses as it relates to system-wide activities. So emission reduction in business air travel really will begin for us with measuring and reporting these emissions. And so we're working closely with financial operations around systems that may help us with this. And we are also seeking immediate support for the growing capacity of virtual tools and platforms across operational and academic functions. And finally, as we've touched on throughout this presentation, empowering UBCO community members to affect change through their own actions is key to the success of the Climate Action Plan, particularly as it relates to reducing extended impact emissions. And for those of you who've been on campus long enough, you'll remember that's what our Power of You program was all about. We, through the Power of You program, have demonstrated success in energy conservation and operational emission reductions in offices, labs, and student residences. However, now with the inclusion of extended emissions, we need to look at ways to develop new engagement campaigns to support commuting, food, air travel, and waste, and other emerging UBC OCAP focus areas. But all this to say that social change and engagement remains really at the heart of the work that we do, and we see this as being a key component of the Climate Action Plan for UBCO. And worth noting, the CAP 2030 process is really focused on the development of mitigation strategies to reduce fossil fuel impacts. However, we know that responding to climate change will also require the development of adaptation strategies to reduce the effects of climate change. So early work on climate adaptation and resiliency strategies has already begun for UBCO. Specific examples include climate modeling and overland flood path mapping that we've undertaken as part of the Integrated Rainwater Management Plan. We've developed some preliminary climate adaptive design guidance in UBC Okanagan's design guidelines and landscape guidance for climate adaptation and wildfire protection as part of the UBC Okanagan Whole Systems Infrastructure Plan. But further work is definitely needed to kind of bring these pieces together and also look at how we can enhance and embolden our adaptation and resiliency in future. So this will be included as part of the next phase of work following the Climate Action Plan. Okay, in terms of resourcing the Climate Action Plan, the team is actively thinking about how we will move forward with the resourcing for successful implementation. And we're working very closely with various units to align the Climate Action Plan's emerging actions with existing work plans, resources, and budgets wherever possible. However, in addition to the in-kind staff time already committed to the CAP program, additional resources will be required to support capacity building, change management, engagement, and various other campaigns. And so UBC to that end is leading a comprehensive resourcing strategy for the CAP 2030 that will include also considering system level strategies for Vancouver and Okanagan campus. And so this is really about a call to action to you right now. So I've shared with you a little bit about our emerging climate action plan, but we really do encourage your participation in the Q&A following this presentation, and also in the survey components of the public engagement and outreach. We have some great prizes for your participation, and really looking for this information to help guide and further shape the climate action plan. And in terms of next steps, there's a number of technical pieces that need to be completed. We also need to incorporate the feedback from our community in terms of this public engagement process, as well as additional feedback. And we're going to draft the plan over the summer and present it to board for adoption in November. So just another plug on what you can do now, taking action now. So we have a number of resources and links available on our website for how you can get involved. And there's also been a recent presentation by John Madden. So we can provide links to his insights in terms of how you can get involved and create some change and action to help reduce emissions in multiple areas. And again, for those of you who are interested in the power of you or behavior change, we remain really open to obtaining more volunteers for this program as we continue to kind of shape and refine it to respond to this new and emerging climate action plan.